How's it going, everyone? Mr. Cuervo Racing here. Today we're going to talk about the throttle body on your bike on the Raptor 700, and many other Yamaha products use a very similar throttle body. Kind of a general overview, what's going on with them, how they work, what they do, some adjustments as well. So basically, first thing is main product identification. We have the main throttle body housing, which is the bare housing here. This is what we bore and modify for additional power. This is basically what we send as a part. This is a stock used one, but has your main housing, the throttle shaft and plate. Obviously that opens and closes to control airflow to your engine. But besides that, pretty simple, not much. That's all broken down to everything that comes off of it generally. So a couple of sensors, some common things that get mixed up is these two sensors. This is your throttle position sensor. It sits on the side of the throttle body. If you're looking at the bike from the right hand side or passenger side, you'd say, you will see this sensor midway up the mid frame. That is the throttle position sensor. That changes with opening and closing of the throttle plate. Now you have your air pressure sensor here that's mounted on the fuel rail. That sensor tells ECU how much vacuum and when it's seeing a vacuum pulse on the engine. Now what gets mixed up a lot is this connector and this connector are identical. Those two plugs, a lot of guys when they're plugging in power commanders, they mix those up. So just know your throttle position sensor is on the side of the throttle body and the pressure sensor is on the fuel rail. It's bolted on the fuel rail. You have your fuel injector right here. These unbolt with, unfortunately the factory uses Phillips number 3. And if you don't use some type of impact driver to break those loose, it's very easy to strip those out. So I recommend using some type of impact driver or impact setting on a drill. So there's one other part on here. It's a mechanical valve. This valve here controls airflow. It's like a cold start feature, allows additional air when the engine's cold, and it controls that by this coolant line that runs to the cylinder head, and one more hose runs from here to the radiator. And by using the temperature of the coolant, it controls how much this piston inside this valve opens and allows air to go from your intake to, there's a port, and it's hard to see, but it basically comes out and adds additional air right by the injector. Maybe I can see it on this one. Kind of hard to see, but if you see inside that hole on the left hand side, there's a port there. That's where the air from this air bypass valve is going through. Now your normal idle adjustments, you're going to adjust this screw here. This is your standard idle adjustment. It's got a spring on it, turns in and out really easy. That's normally what should be adjusted. If you're changing your throttle body, you're going to need to set the idle stop screw, which is this screw here with the 10mm jam nut. that is controlling how far the plate closes. So if it's not adjusted properly, it's possible that the butterfly inside the throttle body can bind up in the bore, or it's possible that if it's too far closed, that this screw here will not be able to adjust and allow enough airflow for the bike to idle. So if this air bypass valve, if the valve is bad, or if this adjustment on the idle stop screw is adjusted too far in or too far out and the plate is closing too far, then you can run into problem with idle speed being too low. So that kind of goes into adjustment of how to adjust this. There's a few different ways to do it. You can use, let's see if I can get a picture here. You can use a feeler gauge in between the bore and the plate when you're taking off your factory throttle body and see how much room is there. It's a really fine feeler gauge, normally like 1.5 thou is what I've seen works well. But basically, if your idle screw, if you back it out and it doesn't make the engine die, then most likely your idle stop screw is adjusted in too far. So normally what I do on a bike is when I get it running and to set idle speed before I recalibrate the throttle position sensor, I will back this screw out, this idle screw with the spring on it, back it out till it has no real tension on it, and then I'll back the idle stop screw down until the bike wants to die or it's a really low RPM, like 1200 RPM. Once I get it there, I'll lock that screw down, readjust this in, and you should be able to range it from 1200 to a high idle of like 2000, 2100. You should have that range adjustment with this when the idle stop screw is adjusted accordingly. So after those are adjusted accordingly or properly, you'd come back and readjust your throttle position sensor. There's a few methods in the book. One of the easiest things to do is fire up the software for the power commander and use its TPS calibration screen to set your voltage. And they have preset ranges on that power commander screen. And you can see these screws here are Torx. They're T25s, and that's a tamper-proof torque. So you got to get a bit that has a hole in the center of it. See if I can get a picture of that. So this bit has that hole in the center where it can drop in and adjust that. So basically, you loosen these two screws, back them off just a little bit, enough for the sensor to slide. And once you get to the proper setting, then lock it back down. That's the main gist of it, of these throttle bodies. This one's a used one that we bored out before. You can see we have a new plate. The shaft is cut down where you don't see the shaft on the front of it, like this one where you see it on both sides. That's to allow additional airflow and create some more horsepower. So there's one other thing that I'll show you if I can. Sorry about the camera moving around so much. When taking this apart, there's a spring that winds this up that's creating pressure to allow that to return and close the throttle plate. The easiest thing to do when you're taking this apart, first I recommend taking off the throttle position sensor first, so you don't over rotate it or damage it. But easiest thing to do is take a knife or a screwdriver and pull on this spring and release it from the tab that's holding it. And then it's a lot easier to rock this plate off and get those components off after you take this 10mm jam nut off. There's a couple other components in there. It's tough to show exactly how to wind that, but it's about 3/4 of a turn that spring gets wound to return pressure on that. So I hope you learned something. We sell board throttle bodies, ready to go. I have them on the shelf. If you got any questions on install or adjustment of any of our products, just feel free to give us a call. And have a good day. Thanks.